So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. We are recording, and this webinar will get shared on YouTube shortly after, like in the next couple days. We'll get that up on YouTube so that those who can't make it are able to watch the recording. So thank you all for coming this evening. It was really exciting and encouraging and inspiring to see how many people wanted to register for this training and how many people are potentially interested in stepping into the role of Advisory Neighborhood Commissioner. My name is Chelsea Allinger. I'm the Executive Director of Greater Washington. I've been in this role for a little over a year now. I'm also in my second and final term as the Advisory Neighborhood Commissioner for 1D05, which is a single member district in Mount Pleasant. I actually attended GGWash's ANC training back in 2018, and that's what inspired me to run. So, and then kind of, I feel like indirectly led to me then ending up in this job. So watch out if you run, you never know what's going to happen next. But it's being a commissioner has really been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, hands down. I absolutely love the role. The only reason I'm not running for re-election is because of time constraints. My day job's a little busy. But it's given me a real sense of purpose and connection in the community that I call home. And so I'm really excited to be part of this training this evening to share some information about the role with all of you. I'm joined by Alex Baca, who's the DC Policy Director at GGWash, and will be helping to manage the flow of the evening. And I'm also joined by 3 panelists who are all current ANC commissioners who will be sharing their insights and experiences throughout this training as well. And I want to give them the chance to introduce themselves as well. Jonah, do you want to start?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. Thank you to Greater Washington for doing this. My name is Jonah Goodman. I'm an ANC commissioner in 4C10 in Petworth neighborhood in Ward 4. This is my 4th term, and this is my last term. Similarly, also taking a step down. I have a son who's 1 year old, so happy to talk to anyone about running and life with family and young ones. Would love to have that conversation if you want. I've served as my commission's vice chair, secretary, and parliamentarian, and recently started our first committee on our Vision Zero committee, so I had some experience getting that set up in my commission. And again, I got a lot of help from Greater Washington over the time with trainings and whatnot, and one of the only organizations that actually offered training and connections to community for commissioners. So I really appreciate all that they do and glad to be here and helping.
Thank you. Sauleh, would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course, thank you. Sauleh Siddiqui. I am the commissioner for ANC 3C05, which is Cleveland Park. And I've served, this is my first term serving as an ANC commissioner, so I've been for a little less than 2 years an ANC commissioner. I've served as the treasurer of my commission, so I can tell you the pain and absolutely no pleasure of doing that. I've also started our commission's transportation committee, and I serve as the first chair of that transportation committee as well. I also remember attending the GGWash training 2 years ago. And I remember one of the most valuable things was what some of the panelists said. So I'm so happy to provide this back, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions. And thank you, GGWash, for organizing this.
That reminds me, I too was a treasurer for 3 years and was very happy to give that role up. It's a big one. Amber.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chelsea. And shout out to the treasurers. Ours actually just got redistricted, or will be. So the commission will certainly need a new one. I'm Amber Gove. I am commissioner in 6A04, which is in Capitol Hill, and in my single member district includes Lincoln Park and a few blocks east and west of that. I have been a commissioner since September 2017, which is an odd date, but I came in on a special election after our commissioner moved away, and then have served 2 full terms since then. I am the chair of 6A as well, so I'm getting quite a bit better at Robert's rules, but I wouldn't say it's my superpower. I really enjoy connecting with neighbors and our community and continuing to give back to our neighborhood, which has given so much to our family. So thanks for having me tonight.
Thank you. I know there are at least a couple of other current ANC commissioners who are in attendance. And if any of those commissioners would like, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And also, as we move through this evening and as questions come up, if people post questions in the chat, I'd like to encourage other current ANCs or former ANCs to feel free to weigh in the chat, responding to those questions as well. Given the size of the group tonight, I suspect there's going to be a lot of questions. So just a few housekeeping guidelines as we get underway here. We do strongly encourage you to use the Q&A feature to ask questions of the panelists. You'll see that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You know what I just remembered? I wanted to activate captions. We have, auto captions in our Zoom. Alex, do you have the ability to enable that?
Let me give it a shot. I'm not sure that I do, but I will do my best.
Oh, I found it.
Okay.
Nope, I didn't.
Okay.
No, I think I thought that we had to activate it in here and I don't think we do. Okay. That's unfortunate. My apologies if anybody was anticipating the live captioning. Okay. Back to this slide. We encourage you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions of the panelists at any time. And that's going to be the easiest way for us as panelists to keep track of questions, because I expect there to be a lot. But you are also welcome to ask questions in the chat. Questions you send in the chat will be visible to all of the attendees, as well as the panelists, and you might benefit from other current commissioners who are in the audience responding to your questions in real time. So it's your decision as an attendee if you want to send questions in through Q&A or through the chat, but if you want to make sure we see them, use the Q&A. Please keep the discussion in the chat on topic and civil and kind. We have a very large group tonight. We're all here because we care about our city, because we believe in and value civic engagement and want the best for DC. So let's engage with each other in good faith. Given the size of the group, if there is any trolling that's happening or harassing or disruptive behavior, we won't hesitate to remove you from the webinar. We don't want that to happen. We don't expect that to happen, but just really do encourage us to engage with each other in good faith around this quirky institution that exists in our city that we're all here to learn more about. During the Q&A portion of the agenda, which will be toward the end of the evening, feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to be unmuted to ask a question, but we're not going to unmute people as we're moving through slides. There's too many of you, there's too much to get through. So the chat and the Q&A function, typing your questions, will be your best bet up until we get to Q&A at the end. And of course, if my cat or anyone else's cat makes a cameo in in our cameras, that is to be celebrated. And as mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and will be publicly posted. Okay. So our objectives for this evening, our goals are to equip you to run for ANC. Oh, goodness gracious. There we go. Equip you to run for ANC, including making sure you're aware of deadlines and giving you some tips for effective campaigning to help you better understand what the role of being an ANC involves and to help you learn how to serve your constituents effectively. Overall, our hope is that this next cohort of ANC commissioners are positioned to be 340 or 345 of the greatest public servants that DC has ever seen. This training is not about any particular policy agenda. We won't be getting into policy issues per se, really at all. And this is not in any way, shape, or form related to GGWash's ANC endorsement process, which launches later in the summer. We're offering this just as a service to anybody who's running to ANC. Nothing more, nothing less. So tonight's agenda has 4 main parts. We're gonna cover what are ANCs, just the basics, some of which are not necessarily as intuitive or obvious as you might think. Running for ANC, what's involved, how to do it. Being an ANC, similarly, what's involved, how to do it. And then open space for Q&A. So what are ANCs? This is too much text for a PowerPoint slide, but just to summarize, ANC commissioners are nonpartisan, unpaid elected officials who serve 2-year terms in DC. It's a fairly unique feature of DC's home rule charter. And ANC's main job is to be their neighborhood's voice in advising the district government, with emphasis on the word advising, which we'll talk a whole lot more about as we get deeper into this presentation on what powers ANCs actually have or don't have. ANCs have the ability to advise district agencies in an official capacity. That advice is supposed to be given great weight. Again, something we'll discuss more. And ANCs also initiate proactive recommendations for how to improve city services and improve their neighborhoods. Advisory neighborhood commissioners serve on commissions, which you're probably all aware of, but you don't have a solo ANC just kind of floating out there in the ether. ANCs are all part of commissions, which used to range from 2 to 12 commissioners in size. I don't know if in redistricting, I hope we got rid of 2 commissioner. No, there is still one. Okay, that's very silly, but that's a whole other conversation. So this is an important slide. Because of redistricting with the 2020 census, some pretty significant changes are going into effect on January 1st, 2023 for ANCs. Both the single member districts that individual commissioners represent and the overall commission areas in many parts of the city have changed as a result of redistricting. The number of single member districts, or SMDs, that's the territory that one commissioner has jurisdiction over. The number of SMDs is increasing from 296 to 345. That means the number of commissioners is increasing to 345. You may well be running for a seat that didn't previously exist and that doesn't yet exactly exist because our old boundaries are still in effect until the end of this year. The new boundaries under which you'll be running for office go into effect on January 1st. There are 2 websites here where you can see what the new redistricted maps look like. I find the second one a little bit easier and quicker to navigate if you want to go to openanc.org and just make sure you check the little button for 2022 map. And there you can see all the commission areas and all the SMDs in the city. You can also get there through anc.dc.gov. I just find that one a little bit less elegant to navigate. Does anyone else want to, any of the other panelists want to share anything about redistricting and its effect on this election cycle? No? Okay. So running for ANC. Now we get a little bit into the juice of things. So first, at a basic level, what does it take to be eligible to run? It's fairly straightforward. You actually do need to live in the single member district in which you are running. Hopefully that is fairly obvious. You need to have been a resident in that district continuously for the 60 days preceding the day in which you file your nominating petitions, excuse me. You can't hold any other elected public office and can't have been convicted of a felony committed while serving as a commissioner. It's interesting to when you're weighing whether or not to run or want to know who you're running against, it can be helpful to know if anyone else has declared their candidacy in your single member district. Most ANC candidates run unopposed. The panelists we were discussing before this training, in the 2020 race, I actually counted the number of races that were unopposed, and I can't remember. I have in my head that it was something like 2/3 of the seats were running unopposed, but I'm not certain that it was that high, but most seats run unopposed. The Board of Elections publishes an updated candidate list, and they update it daily-ish. I checked today, so the ability to file your declaration of candidacy and get your petitions, which we'll talk more about, so don't worry, but that opened yesterday. So that means there are a bunch of people who have declared their candidacy. I was not able to find a list on the BOE's website today of those people. If I missed it and anyone else has a link, feel free to drop that in the chat. But once this gets rolling, the BOE will generally update that list of ANC candidates just about every day. Oh, it's up. Thank you. Aha, this afternoon. That's why I didn't see it earlier today. Cool. Thanks, folks. So in order to declare your candidacy, you will generally, there are exceptions here, which we'll talk about in a second, but visit the Board of Elections in person to get your ballot access documents. These include petition pages, your declaration of candidacy, and an official calendar. The pickup, as mentioned, began yesterday. You can request, there's a form for this, that the BOE email you a list of all registered voters in your single member district, which may be helpful depending on what sort of campaigning you intend to do. And then 2 tips when you go to declare your candidacy and pick up your paperwork. First, double check your information for accuracy in the candidate list that the Board of Elections publishes. They have been known to make mistakes. Once they have the wrong phone number or something for you in that candidate list, it can cause all sorts of problems. So check that list regularly after you go to the BOE and file your paperwork so that you catch any mistakes as quickly as possible if there are any mistakes in the publicly posted information. And secondly, you may want to set up a separate email address and or phone number for your campaign, both to help just in your personal life, stay organized, but maybe more importantly, if you use just your regular personal email address to file your campaign paperwork, not only is that personal email address then going to be publicly shared, but you will be getting DC government emails to that email list for the rest of time. So having a campaign specific email may be helpful. Amber, do you want to talk a little bit more about picking up the petitions and some nuances to that process?
Sure. Thanks, Chelsea. First of all, a shout out to my fellow Commissioner Laura Gentili, who graciously, since I am out of town, was able to pick up my petitions yesterday. It went fairly well. There was a little bit of confusion, I think, on both ends, and I had a 20-minute call with Board of Elections who said, you need this other thing, and then it turned out I didn't need this other thing. So it all worked out in the end. But it can feel a little bit like going to the DMV where you think you have the 10 documents you're supposed to have and you are missing the 12th and the 13th. And so just double check. It's helpful to get things in writing or speak to a live person on occasion. But I also missed a form, I think, last time around, and then had to follow up and do another form. So read things 3 times and get someone to confirm that it's the right thing, and hopefully it'll all work very smoothly for you.
Jonah, did you want to talk?
Yeah, your comment about the email access. I actually had somebody ask me this, and it was a great question. If for some reason there's concerns about publicizing your contact information, be aware that this has to go out publicly. So your neighbors will have access to your address, a phone number, and an email account. Now, your email can be a burner email account that you just set up just for this. That's fine. You can set up a Google Voice number. That's not your real number, but you're going to have to give your actual physical address, and if that's an apartment or something. So if there is concern about that, something to be aware of. It will be out there for the public. So I know some people kind of have privacy concerns with it. It's something to prove residency. So it is going to be a requirement.
Thank you for that.
And I see a question in the chat about changing email. I also have that question, since apparently one of my emails that went on there is not the one that I was hoping to use. So I will, if I get an answer to that, I will let you know. But Board of Elections has been helpful. Sometimes just getting somebody on the phone can be really useful. So I would recommend starting there.
I would agree that getting someone on the phone is helpful. I would then follow it up with an email to them that specifies who you talked to on the phone and what was discussed, so that it is in writing, but getting them on the phone tends to be helpful. My experience with the BOE is that they are very helpful, but mistakes happen. And I think especially with ANCs where it's hundreds and hundreds of candidates, they're a little overwhelmed right now too. So it may take some persistence on your part. So petition signatures and your candidate filing. You are, in order to get your name on the ballot, you're required to collect petition signatures from 25 registered voters who live in your single member district. Few pieces of advice here. You definitely want to collect more than 25 signatures. Definitely, like significantly more. Push it to 35 or 40 if you can't, like give yourself a safe buffer for a few reasons. It's not uncommon for petition challenges to happen where someone, basically requests that checks challenges that says that some of your signatures are invalid, are from people that don't live in your district, etc. It's really pretty common for people to get kicked off the ballot and not end up on the ballot because their petitions get challenged and they fall below 25 signatures. And even if you're really careful about doing your due diligence in terms of making sure people are registered in your district, you're almost guaranteed to make an innocent mistake on a couple of them, or people are confused about whether they're registered or not. Like, just mistakes happen. So get more than 25 signatures. In terms of getting those signatures, I think I have a slide that gets into this a little bit more, but one thing that I found really helpful when I was collecting signatures was I carried a printout of a map of my commission area with me, because 95% of the people you talk to or more have no idea what single member district they live in. None. You're like, I think my commissioner is like Henry or something. Like, people have no idea. So if you have a printout of that map, it creates an opportunity for actually a meaningful engagement interaction with the voter, whether they live in your SMD or not, because you can help them find their SMD. You can find it on the map, then they'll know who their commissioner is, then they'll know who's running. And then you can feel a little bit more confident that the signatures you're getting are actually from people who live in your SMD. Once you do collect all your signatures, you can submit that candidate filing via email, mail, or in person. There's more detail about that on the BOE's website. And in terms of tactics for collecting signatures, I realized I had this on the slide and then moved it to a different one, but just to talk about that a little bit. And then I welcome the other panelists to share their experiences of collecting signatures. There's a pretty good chance you may not know 25 people who live in your SMD, even if you know 25 people who live in your neighborhood, because the SMDs are funky chunks of space carved out of your neighborhood. I had a lot of luck in my neighborhood standing at the farmer's market for a few hours. I think I did that twice, got all my signatures. To the people that you do know, ask them if they can recommend one or two other people that would be willing to sign your petition. So use that word of mouth to make those connections, or stand on a busy corner, a street corner of the commercial strip in your neighborhood, even if it's not in your SMD, if it's a commercial area where anyone who lives in the neighborhood is likely to be frequenting, you're going to find people who live in your SMD, even if you're collecting signatures just outside of your SMD. Any other signature collecting tips from anybody else?
Go ahead, Amber.
I was just going to add, I have found that I know probably at least one person on each block within my SMD. And so connecting with that person, developing that relationship, and then walking around with them is something that I've done previously for collecting signatures, and that works really well. And you could make it a fun evening, grab your clipboard and walk up and down their block or the block adjacent, and make that something that you can do together to help collect signatures.
Sauleh?
Yeah, just to be, again, not to scare anyone, but just have to be a little careful in who's collecting signatures as well. So you might get someone who collects for you, but just be very careful with that they're signing in the collection. That you'll see there's a form there for where to sign, but also what date they sign. That's also very, very important. And so the dates that people sign, the dates on that you're collecting signatures, all those things on the form are what people can use to challenge any petition signatures.
That's a really good point. I did all of my signature collection myself because it was a small enough number. And I was wary of kind of opening myself up to additional risk like that. But you can have other people help you collect signatures, and there is a little form that has to be filled out at the top by the person who's doing the signature collecting for you. If anyone else has tips on that, because it was not something that I did myself. But you're right, that's an area where people get tripped up a lot.
I had to go through this, and probably like this time it'll be some of that too, is because people didn't want to meet me because it was COVID. They was like, we'd like to sign, but we'd rather meet our neighbors or something. And so even if someone grabs it and is like, I'm going to get my partner to sign, they then suddenly, you didn't see the other person sign. And so technically that's not allowed, and just to be careful of that part.
You can all be glad that you're not running in 2020 when they reduced the signature requirement because of the pandemic, but nothing was in person. It was just even getting a reduced number of signatures was far more complicated.
Chelsea, there was a comment, a couple of them in the thing about who can sign for you. So they have to be registered. They have to live in your SMD, and they have to be registered to vote in your SMD. They can be registered to any party, as long as they're a registered voter at that location in your place. Remember, you can sign your own petition because you are a registered voter in your own SMD. Anyone in your family or household that's eligible to vote as well, feel free. I like the idea of going to like high traffic corridors. Just remember, sometimes these are often on boundaries of multiple SMDs. So a farmer's market is going to get residents from multiple SMDs. Just because they're there and it's in your SMD doesn't mean that they live there. So you might have to have a lot of conversations about like, wait, where do you live? Show me on a map, make sure it is. I personally prefer to just go to door or do things like trash cleanup on blocks. And so when people would see me, I'd kind of have that, hey, I'm running for this. Can I stop by and get you to sign this? And then I know exactly like which house. One tip that I like doing, I have a Google map of my SMD, and I drop a pin every time I talk to somebody about like their name, what I talked about if I knew anything. And so if they're going to sign the petition for you, drop a pin so you can know who they come back to, because you're probably going to want to come back to them come election time and ask for their vote as well. Or come back to them and say, hey, remember you signed that and we talked about that abandoned car on the block. I have some leads on how we can fix that, do that. So as you're getting ballot petition signatures, also see if you can get their address and figure out where they are, what issues they're interested in.
Anything else on petition signatures? It may have come up in the chat, but just because someone signs your petition, doesn't mean they are voting for you or have to vote for you or even necessarily support your candidacy. I know that's a question that has come up when I've been collecting signatures. And some folks just will sign anybody's petition because it's democracy. It's like, you want to support democracy and people getting on the ballot. It doesn't state anything one way or another about their support for you or not. But as Jonah said, you still might want to use that petition signature as an opportunity to engage with that resident down the line. Okay, so some subjective advice on running effectively. This is a question that comes up a lot, relates to how much does it cost to run for an ANC seat and what does fundraising look like? Effective ANC campaigns can cost very little money, virtually no money. And we'll unpack that a little bit more, but fundraising may or may not be necessary for your campaign. And something to keep in mind is that if you do decide to fundraise for your campaign, there will be a little bit more paperwork and reporting that's required. And you may or may not be comfortable really taking that on. Most ANC campaigns don't have mass numbers of volunteers attached to them. It's mostly going to be you doing this stuff. So whether fundraising, building out the infrastructure to do fundraising is something that you want to take on or not is something for you to work through yourself, but just know it's not necessary. You can run a really good campaign spending very little money or self-funding if you're able to do so. To the extent that you do spend money on your campaign, keep all your receipts. You will need to do some paperwork at the end of your campaign, even if you just self-fund it. And if you do choose to fundraise, the maximum contribution limit is $25. You can give as much of your own money to your campaign as you want, but the maximum that any other individual can give to your campaign is $25. And then there's a little bit of data here that I got from Jonah from this document that he may want to pop a link to it in the chat, and we could probably circulate it after the fact. It's kind of a guide to running for and being an ANC. But this is the 2020 breakdown of funds raised by all candidates for ANC races. And as you can see, 181 of them raised $0. I was one of those. I didn't do any fundraising for either of my campaigns. I'm sure there's questions about this and other comments and insights that some of the other panelists have. Have any of you done fundraising for your campaigns, or have you self-funded? And what did that look like?
I did. This is my fourth term. 3 of mine were unopposed, so I raised no money. There was really no reason. I did a lot of just talking to neighbors. My last campaign was a competitive one I raised. I was in the over 1,000, I think 1,200 range. I used ActBlue. It was wonderful for collecting information, reporting. I could download reports automatically. It was very easy for me in terms of financial filing to just sum total and not worry about collecting checks or deposit into personal bank accounts and stuff. You do have to deposit the money into an account. Some people have different opinions on, should you set up a campaign specific account? Can you use your own personal account? I'll let you all figure out like what's best for you with that. There's not a requirement. Just do what's the best to be able to file the paperwork appropriately at the end. I raised all my money just through social media, just put links up and asked people if they wanted to give. I didn't do any hard asks of family or anything else. So yeah, that was my experience. It was relatively easy, and I'll post a link to what the financial form looks like at the end of the year, just so you have an understanding of, this is my form. It's all public of what you'll be expected to report if you do want to raise money.
Yeah, I was also one of the raised over 1,000 people, I think about 1,300. And I initially did not want to do it at all. And I was opposed to it. But then my campaign became incredibly competitive and realized that we needed signs and everything else. So I actually didn't even set up an ActBlue. I had sort of, Venmo donations, or some people even gave cash, and there's ways to report that as well. I will say that for me, even though I didn't use ActBlue, the burden wasn't too difficult in filing this. So I would say if you would like to raise money, it's actually not that hard. The reporting requirements are there and you have to be careful, but it's not something that's incredibly difficult.
And I did not fundraise last time around or the time prior. I was unopposed 2 elections ago and had one person run against me last time around. I bought the yard signs and then submitted that for the documentation for the person who was asking about the documentation on the receipts. So just again, keep those receipts, and I was able to order yard signs and distribute those around, and didn't spend that much money on them. So that's also an option. This time around, I will be using ActBlue and setting up a location to do that. But yes, the one advice I'd heard on that is remind everyone they can really only give $25 once. And if they give more than that, you will have to write a check and return the funds to them.
In my
Sorry, I see a yard sign question. I'm sure it's filed somewhere. I think the yard signs were maybe $500 total. There are websites to get them. There's one, you want to look for one that also has a union bug, if that's something that you're interested in supporting, that it's a unionized group to order your yard signs from. But maybe folks can, I think mine may have been, to Laura's point, Vistaprint or one of those as well.
My first campaign in 2018 was a contested race. I self-funded, and if I recall correctly, I think I spent about $300 or $350 on my campaign, and that was primarily for signs. But I didn't even do normal, like the campaign yard signs. I just did like little 5x7 glossy signs that I think I got printed at FedEx, and I just had like a few bullet points of my policy priorities on there in my face and stuck those on telephone poles in the neighborhood. And I think that was actually surprisingly effective. My theory is because it wasn't just my name, like vote Chelsea for ANC, but it had like my half dozen policies that I cared most about, which I suspect kind of helped people understand who I was beyond just a name. But I didn't have a website. I set up a ANC Twitter, I think at that time was when I set it up, and I set up an ANC Facebook page, so that a campaign Facebook page, so that if people Googled me, some stuff would come up related to my campaign. But what you need to do, we'll get more into this, the actual campaign tactics. This is just cost. I just kept costs as minimal as possible. There will be races, as Jonah and Sauleh have pointed out, like where races get more competitive and the pressure to have more money, more resources will become more apparent.
And just note, all candidates, if you raise money, you will have to file this. If you lose your election, you still have to file this. So don't come November, be like, forget it, throw everything away. The Office of Campaign Finance will come find you, and you have 90 days or some period of time that you have to file. If you don't file, there are potential fines that you will start incurring. So don't think your election was over if you weren't successful, and it doesn't matter. Only the winner had to file. So be really careful. Be diligent with your paperwork.
Good point. And yet again, save all your receipts. Okay, so now a little bit more on what it looks like to campaign. Beyond cost, talking about actual tactics that you can use. So there's different channels that you have available to you. Social media, you can set up a website, you can hang posters in the neighborhood, you can send mailers, though that's a little more uncommon for ANC seats. You can set up an email list and try to get people to subscribe for it. No, you did not get elected yet. Backtrack. Okay. And in terms of, and then there's different tactics for meeting voters face-to-face. Knocking on doors, hosting meet and greets, virtual or in person, meeting neighbors at farmers markets or on commercial strips. And then on election day, something that I personally found probably more effective than anything else. In 2018, 2020 was messed up with the pandemic, but in 2018, I stood outside the polling place for 12 hours on election day and talked to every voter that I could as they were coming to vote. Because the thing about the ANC seat is that I would guess most voters maybe don't even know what it is, don't really realize it's on the ballot until they get there. So your ability to connect with voters on the spot on election day is going to put you in touch with a lot of people who had no idea this was even a seat to vote for. It's a very efficient way to drum up some votes. I'd love to just create space for the other panelists to talk about what tactics you've all used in your campaigns, what you have found more or less effective in your experience.
Maybe I can start this time. The email list in particular. So I've built up a Google group over the last few years, or whatever format you want to do. That was sort of the most low tech way that I could approach it. I also had a Google form at one point for folks to sign up for yard signs. And those have been very useful to keep in touch with constituents. A reminder to always use the BCC function and make sure you set up whatever group that you're working in. If you intend it to be a one-way communication of you communicating out, make sure that you get those settings clarified from the beginning and set up in the right way. But I found that a useful way to connect with people in addition to the door knocking with neighbors part of it. And then it's great to be able to follow up with them. As a commissioner in the actual work of it, the single greatest complaint we always get is I wasn't properly notified, or I did not know about that thing that you were doing with DDOT that's been in the work for 10 years, but I missed all the 20 public meetings on it. So we, in addition to having our standard notifications, I tend to push out a little update to my residents. And of the 2,000 or so that I represent now, I have about 700 emails, which isn't everybody, but it's a pretty significant list. And I found that to be really, really useful for keeping in touch with people.
Oh, sure. Sorry, I saw you unmute as I did. I actually did the mailer. So I'll talk a little bit about this and like why I chose to do it. It's kind of rare, probably. One, I threw a campaign contribution thing online and I really didn't expect to get much. And I probably brought in more money than I figured I needed for my campaign. And so one, I was just like, I can support USPS at a time when they need additional funds thrown at them. So just one, like support your local letter carriers, right? I have a large enough population in my district that's not English as a first language speaking. And I predominantly Spanish as a primary language. I do not speak any kind of Spanish at all. And to be able to engage with them and understand, I thought sending print through mail would be one of the easiest ways to kind of get my message across and talk to them. So I paid for professional translation services, not a friend, not any kind of amateur stuff. I wanted to make sure everything was correct and run this campaign effectively. So I did that. US Post Office has a really fascinating, easy tools. You can do this thing called Every Door or something. I forget what it's called offhand.
Direct mail, EDDM.
Yes, Every Door direct mail. And so what you'll do is you put in your address and they'll draw on a map the boundaries, and you just keep adding to it until it covers your S&D, and then they will just blanket every house with something. You just have to drop it off at your local post office. You put a little form on it saying what it is, and then you prepay online. Now the challenge with this is the boundaries don't nicely meet your S&D, so you're going to have some overlap either into other S&Ds, which to me was just okay. It's fine. They're going to get my mail. They can't vote for me. No harm. But it was better to get everyone than not get everyone. And I think with language issues, I found it super effective to do print outreach that way. I also did door hangers. I didn't do anything like robocalling or bulk texting or any of that kind of paid stuff. The one thing I would share, Chelsea's going out to polling sites. I never went to a polling site, actually. I did all my work ahead of time. For me, there was a lot of other noise. There's so many other elections happening to break through up on the day of election with a mayoral race, council races, attorney general's race. I was just like, no way people are going to pay attention to me. So I didn't think it was effective for me. And that was a personal choice. But also realize if you do go to a polling locations serve multiple SMDs. So the voter walking up, there's a very likelihood they're coming from 4, 5, 6, 7 different ANC SMDs to that site. And so you're going to have that conversation similar to like a farmer's market. Where do you live? show me where it is. Let's look at the map together. And sometimes a voter doesn't want to stop and kind of have that level of engagement on election day. So I personally avoided it.
There are a couple questions to Chelsea in the Q&A. If we maybe can answer one of those live. There's a question about advice on campaigning in exclusively large apartment buildings. I just have one of those, but my approach there has been to have, again, engage with at least one other person there who may have access to the apartment building email list. They may speak up on my behalf and indicate, I'm giving them talking points and indicate what I've been doing on behalf of the community. So as one way to connect, but again, reaching out to hopefully get those individuals to also sign up on your email distribution list so that you can keep in touch with them.
I want to jump in and note that I think Ben had a great suggestion for large apartment buildings also, which is post on Nextdoor or Facebook groups that you'll be somewhere accessible, that people can meet you to sign petitions, so that you don't have to jump into people's apartment buildings otherwise. So that is something to also like communicate where you are. You can do that on Nextdoor, you can do that on Facebook, you can do that on Twitter. You may want to do that through email list with the voter file. It's not going to be super easy. You know, I myself have lived in a building, not where I was campaigning for ANC, but where I needed to talk to my neighbors. And it's definitely not as easy as knocking on doors on single family home street, but telling people where you're going to be and what they can expect will probably be super helpful.
Sauleh?
Yeah, I just want to add, I mean, I think all those suggestions are good. And I think the meet and greets and the mailers / postcards for apartment buildings can be very effective. I have a lot of apartment buildings where I am, and you know, targeted postcards to apartment dwellers helped. I was like, yeah, I live in an apartment, and you know, this is very helpful. You know, like we're sort of living in a similar type thing. I understand your problems. I think things like that can be really beneficial in apartment buildings, and also meet and greets. You know, usually apartment buildings have, like Alex mentioned, like a mailing list or something. And if you can have an apartment building focused meet and greet, that often really, really helps as well, because they kind of see themselves in that.
Any other thoughts on campaign tactics that we've used in our respective campaigns? Yes.
I'll just throw out, because we haven't quite touched it. I'm sure it's going to be a topic that comes up. If you are an online digital person like me, I live on Twitter all day long, really just understand that most of your community is not like that. And if you're using a social channel to reach, you're really missing a very large portion of your community that does not engage there. And so sometimes, you know, you'll see people get out of that political bubble of what Twitter world thinks or what Facebook thinks or what Nextdoor thinks. There's a lot of population that, you know, is not online, is not on social. So really just think about how you want to be creative with reaching out to your neighbors and fully representational of everyone that lives in your SMD that you want their votes for. Go and get them in the ways that those neighbors want to communicate with you.
That's a really good point. Thank you for mentioning that. I have found Twitter to be very helpful in my ANC capacity for interacting with other ANC commissioners. It has been almost useless for interacting with constituents. There's like a half a dozen constituents, I think, who follow me on Twitter. The way that, for me in my campaigns, the way I met neighbors was much more face-to-face. And some posting on Nextdoor, because I do, at least in my neighborhood, there are a lot of people on Nextdoor who are not spending their lives on Twitter. Nextdoor seems to have reached a segment of people that's different from, say, Twitter or Facebook. But for me, the farmers market interactions, I've had a few meet and greets that neighbors have set up on my behalf. For me, the standing at the polling place was really effective. Those face-to-face interactions made a big difference. And the paper, the little posters I hung in the neighborhood. Sauleh, go ahead.
Yeah, just want to add, the other thing that helped, at least in my neighborhood, was endorsements. So I know, like you mentioned, like this organization endorses, but they're not a lot, but there are a few organizations all over the city that do endorse ANC commissioners. And your local neighborhood association or neighborhood organization might also endorse. They also had forums, like candidate forums for ANCs. And so if you have a local organization, or if you can find out which organizations endorse ANCs, that's a really good way to get your message out as well.
I'm seeing some questions in the Q&A, and if they're topics that we've talked about earlier, we're just going to hold on them. I just want you to know, if you're sending questions through the Q&A, we're seeing them. We will get to them in the Q&A section. Okay, you got elected. Now what? We're going to talk a little bit about what it's like being an ANC, what the role involves. It wouldn't be a local government discussion without a little Leslie Knope in there. Some of you probably heard or seen this episode. So what I hear when I'm being yelled at is people caring loudly at me. Sometimes being an ANC is like that. Fortunately, most of the time it is not. So one of the first questions that comes up when considering whether or not to run for ANC is, what's the time commitment that I'm looking at? And the answer to that is it varies depending on a lot of different factors, and also depending on how much you personally decide to put into it. So one of those factors is your commission area. How much development is happening in your neighborhood, and how many liquor licenses are there? Those two factors alone are going to have a dramatic impact on the volume of work that flows through your commission. Whether or not your ANC has paid administrative help has a big impact. I'm on a 5-person commission that does not have paid administrative help, and regularly 50% of what I'm doing is admin stuff that theoretically could be outsourced to paid help. That's a conversation we could get more into. If you're an officer or a committee chair, that will increase the amount of time that you spend on the role. A couple of us have been treasurers. That is a huge time suck. That on its own could kind of, it just is a huge, there were points in time where the majority of my ANC time was spent on treasurer stuff. There are also just time sensitive and time limited or short-term situations that are going to come up that end up taking a lot of your time for a limited amount of time. That might be a public safety situation. That might be a hearing that you need to testify in, and there's a lot of work that goes into preparing your testimony. That might be something that came up in my role, was a project to convert to design. We have an empty parcel of land in my SMD, and we had a community planning process to turn it into a green space, kind of a pocket park for the neighborhood. There was a point in time there where I spent an enormous, the community outreach to kick off that planning process was for 2 or 3 weeks, taking like 25 or 30 hours a week of my time. So that was a very short term, but very intensive moment in time. But it's not always, those things come up, but that's not the norm. It's safe to say that an average number of hours per week that you would spend in this role is something like 5 to 8. There will be some weeks where basically nothing happens. There will be some weeks where lots happens, and it's a lot more time than that. I think the most important thing to keep in mind about this role is that it could be full-time if you let it, and don't let it. The amount that you could do with your ANC position is endless. And you'll probably have moments in time where you feel like you're not doing enough, or you look at the list of all the things you want to be working on, and maybe you feel defeated or you feel overwhelmed. You're not a full-time council member with a team of constituent services staff. You're not the mayor's office of community relations. You're just one person. It's an unpaid position. So much of this role, when it comes to the time commitment, is about drawing effective boundaries around your own life so that you're putting in, like, you're doing a good job serving your neighborhood, but you're drawing reasonable boundaries because you're unpaid. You can't do it all. You shouldn't feel like you have to do it all. So it's a combination of outside circumstances that are going to affect how much time you're putting in, but then also getting as good as possible at drawing lines to prevent overwhelm. I know others have thoughts on this as well. It's something that we all struggle with.
So, oops, please.
I'll just start real quick. I was going to add just one point that we have of our 4 committees. Those are really all led by other volunteers who aren't commissioners. It's something that are maybe special to our commission. I'm not certain, but that allows commissioners to be able to be a part of those committees and serve and contribute to votes, but not necessarily count for quorum, which is another thing we can talk about. So that may be something to consider. And then Chelsea's point of setting boundaries, I also like to really empower residents not to solve things always directly for them. So here's the way, if it's a resident that I know can really do it on their own and is able to submit it through in one request, I may direct them to the type of ticket that I might require and then say, forward me the service request number once if it doesn't get followed up on or if something happens to it. But as a starting point, here's how you can do this on your own. And I'm happy to help you if it doesn't get done.
I think a lot of residents don't realize that ANCs are unpaid and that we're squeezing this in around the rest of our lives. And I would say, don't be afraid of telling people that. Sometimes folks have maybe unrealistic expectations about how much time an ANC is able to dedicate to their particular situation relative to everybody else's situations. And the ANC is just like a very mysterious role. Just nobody knows what it is. Just occasionally you'll run into a problem and somebody will say, email your ANC. So you do. You don't know who that person is or what they do. So if you do, I think it's okay to say that to folks. You know, this is a part-time role. I'm going to connect you to someone else who can help, and we'll get more into what that sort of help can look like.
Say, Chelsea, can I add one comment there, just like on the other side of things as you're thinking about our role with the community. Think about also your role with whoever is in your direct life. If there's a partner, family, somebody that you live with, that you are committed to time and support and whatnot, I would just recommend have an honest conversation with them and say, tell me when you need me to cut back on what I'm doing. Be that person to put the boundaries if I can't put on myself. Some of the best, most successful commissioners I've seen really have that honest relationship and can take a strong step back when they're told, okay, it's time to slow down and let somebody else do some of this work.
So this next slide, actually, I do want to talk about the question that just came up in the chat around responsiveness on evenings and weekends. You've got to draw your own boundaries. You've got to draw your own boundaries. For me, I can only be responsive on evenings and weekends because during the day, I'm too busy at work to check my ANC email. But that means I'm not responsive every evening and every day in the weekend because that would be too much. That would be no space left for just me. So generally speaking, the inquiries that you're getting, the emails that you're getting are not super urgent. If someone hears back from you in a couple days, you're probably okay. But this is the sort of balancing act. And different commissioners have different standards, different ways that they approach responsiveness. But you can burn out in this role. And you need to set parameters that are going to make it sustainable for you because that's better for your community in the long run. Commissioners, I think commissioners kind of hit their stride in their second term. So don't burn yourself out in the first one because the second one is when you've finally figured out kind of what you're doing. So this slide is somewhat related to the conversation that we have been having. What's it take to be a good ANC and how do I get there? And we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the qualities that we see in really effective commissioners, what the role of expertise is in an ANCC and what that even means. And I think this gets at one of the questions that came up in the chat. And then what are other resources available to you for things where you're not an expert or you're not the right person? So in no particular order, some of the qualities that we've identified that we think make for a good ANC commissioner include thoughtfulness, responsiveness, persistence, which is a word we'll talk a lot more about when it comes to how do you actually make change happen in this role. Having a collaborative approach to work. So building in a way where you're building relationships with other commissioners or with other community leaders, just a collaborative personality, a sense of curiosity and compassion, a sensitivity to exclusionary and unequal power dynamics. I will say this shows up in everything in this role. Who turns up to community meetings and who doesn't? And how does that impact whose voices get listened to and whose don't? Who's able to find you on social media? Which residents are you missing because they're not on social media? Are you serving constituents where there's a language barrier and you have a responsibility to work through that so that you're reaching the people you represent? When DC agencies are making decisions, how are they failing to factor in I'll give a really concrete example of kind of where this shows up. At the outset of the pandemic, DC government very quickly rolled out WebEx as kind of the online platform that they were going to use for all their online community meetings as everything went virtual. And WebEx at the time, I don't know if they fixed this, did not have a way to offer real-time language interpretation. In my neighborhood, about a quarter of the residents speak Spanish as their first language. So with that one decision, DC government had cut off a huge share of people in my neighborhood from their ability to access information and engage in community meetings during a public health emergency. And that was a decision got made in like the IT department of DC government that was missing that lens of making sure that they were being inclusive and creating a space that was reachable for everybody. So that became like a fight that I was fighting. Our ANC in Mount Pleasant offers Spanish interpretation at all of our commission meetings. So that's just a lens that our commission has had for a really long time that like the rest of DC government didn't. But these are the sorts of dynamics that just again and again and again show up in this role. And if you're not working to sensitize yourself to these sorts of power dynamics, you're not going to be reaching or serving or best representing the people in your neighborhood who probably in various ways most need good representation. Other characteristics, integrity, which I hope goes without saying, but we want our public servants to have integrity, the ability to be firm when needed, especially when you're being persistent in pushing for change, the ability to stay on top of email, and the ability to set boundaries, which we just talked a lot about on the prior slide. And then expertise. There's a question mark here for a reason, because I think running for this seat can feel daunting. Maybe you're not an expert in the zoning code. Maybe you barely know there is a zoning code. If terms like FLUM or PUD or TSA might not mean anything to you, that's actually okay. You don't need to have all the answers, and you absolutely will not have all you won't have most of the answers when you start in this role. It will be a huge learning curve. So what matters is being willing to ask questions, to do a bit of research, to listen, to learn, and listen and listen and listen. I think the first 6 months that I was an ANC commissioner, I spent more time just listening to my fellow commissioners and learning from their experience and asking questions when they were dropping terminology that I didn't know. And also recognize that there's room for different skill sets. So being the policy wonk who knows everything about the zoning code is a great and is a really valuable role. But commissions also benefit from having commissioners who are good with people, who have good networks in the community, are good at community outreach, can really connect with residents and do a good job of making sure residents are heard. Commissions benefit from having people who are administrative pros or process pros, like the Roberts Rules experts. There's all sorts of different skill sets that make for good commissioners. And you'll also build relationships with other commissioners whose skills and knowledge complement yours. So you're not going to be in this alone. You're going to end up forming really productive partnerships with other commissioners, and you're going to be stronger collectively as a result. And just be patient with yourself. You'll learn a ton. Before I get into other resources, do any of the other panelists want to add anything around kind of qualities and expertise and skills?
I'm going to jump in and say that there are probably not as many trainings as you would like to be provided by the district government, but there are some. So there is a FOIA training. There is a training from Office of Zoning on PUDs and map amendments. So this, like, none of these are perfect, like, to be clear, but they are resources that will be available to you. And one of the sort of like things that we always suggest to ANCs when we talk to people is also to reach out to those resources. So I believe Chelsea has some remarks about, you know, being good at email. Those may come up sooner, but like when you can get resources to other people whose job it is, who they are actually paid to answer this, that can be really helpful, including MOCers, including council staff. So be sure to look out for the resources that are available to you. I will say that they are not as accessible or as amazing as they should be, but they are there, and take advantage of them. We've also run some trainings in the past, and I will say for my part, I hope that this is something that we can do in 2023 of like getting ANC commissioners together and pooling resources and just talking about what you need. I will be honest, I struggled with doing some of that during the pandemic, but I think that may be changing going forward, and we can better match up what GGWash can provide alongside the district government.
Thank you for mentioning that. Yes, when you first are elected, in the probably 3 to 4 months afterward, after you take office, you'll get continual emails about trainings, Office of Attorney General, Office of Planning, historic preservation trainings, the FOIA trainings. There's so many.
And remember, or not remember, just note that these trainings are going to happen on like a rolling basis, and usually at times that aren't good for everybody. There's going to be daytime trainings that just don't work for most of us. There's going to be nighttime trainings that don't work for parents. And it's rough. And there's a very realistic possibility that you're going to, should you win your election, you'll come in and you'll have an ABRA case or a zoning case, and you haven't had the zoning training yet. So it's really important to work with others that have that experience to cultivate it, and kind of find those. You know, for me, I found those voices. The one thing that I think Chelsea mentioned, finding other commissioners on social media is really helpful. I found Twitter really effective to find commissioners in other wards that were really smart about stuff and go to them. I also, you know, I think a good lesson early on is don't try to be the expert in all policy advocacy areas. Realize you can just drop an issue. I'd say for me, like education policy and local schooling is just something that, you know, on top of all the other things, is really rough for me to kind of wrap my head around and understand everything. And I used others, and, you know, find other commissioners who want to excel in that area and use your soapbox, use your platform to elevate them and their voices and let them be that lead in that subject area, and go with it. I'd also say, like, I don't know, or let me just say, I think one of the nice areas of GGWash with that they've done effectively in ways I think we can really push on is bringing community together. There are groups that do like commissioner email lists where they can have like conversations, say, I need help, who does this? And GGWash is kind of a nice area that kind of pulls some of that community together sometimes. So, you know, stay tuned to the stuff they do put out there. It is really effective, but it's not super effective. There's not a lot of other effective organizations that are really doing this. The last thing I just mentioned, because I don't think we're going to get into it too much on this, but in the training specifically, I like that there's a BEGA training that's going to be super critical, especially if you are a federal or district employee and have to deal with Hatch Act or local Hatch Act. I will say, put that training on your calendar and absolutely do it. There's a lot of requirements that you need to be aware of that we probably can't get into on this call. If you have those questions, follow up with some of us outside of us, and we can point you to really good resources.
BEGA is Board of Ethics and Government Accountability. Is that what it stands for? Yeah. So other
Chelsea,
yeah.
sorry, one quick thing on the listening and the who's in the room and who's not in the room. We actually took, and I just posted it to the chat for everyone. We took the additional step of enshrining this in our standard operating procedures, perhaps as a reminder. I'll share that document link around, of just reminding that it is a very select group of folks who come to your meetings, whether they're virtual or not, whether that's not everybody can make it to an elementary school cafeteria at 7 o'clock on a Thursday night. So reminding yourself, but reminding also those who are in the room that they are not the only voices that need to be heard is something that I think commissioners really need to get good at. And that's a hard message to balance.
Chelsea, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to reiterate that one thing you said about expertise. Everyone has the expertise. You will always, if you're a good commissioner, you do feel like you don't know enough. So please run. I know several commissioners who have way less expertise than even the average citizen, and several non-commissioners who have way more than all the, maybe the most knowledgeable commissioners. The other thing I just want to reiterate is the idea that we're connectors, right? So Chelsea and others already touched on this, like just connect people to the resources they need, but also just connect whether it was other ANCs have done. Oftentimes, if our ANC wants to do something, we find a resolution from another ANC that's been very effective in that. There's one ANC in particular that's very, very good at this. You'll figure out which one that is pretty quickly as soon as you're an ANC commissioner. And so those types of things are really help. So don't see yourself as the person who has the answers. You're in a really good position to connect different things.
Yeah, if you think of yourself as a connector more so than as the source of answers, you'll be a lot less stressed out and probably a lot more effective right out of the gate. I wished I had learned that lesson sooner, because people will email you expecting you to have the answer to like, my permit from DC Water is not getting approved. And how do I, like, I don't know anyone at DC Water. That was a real situation that came up. But what I did in that case was I emailed our MOCR, which is the Mayor's Office of Community Relations, which has representatives in every ward who are focused on each ward. And he fixed it. So, and the constituent was happy. I was happy. I learned something about DC Water. So yeah, thinking of this role as one that connects people to the help that they need rather than that it's your responsibility to have all the answers will go a long way.
And to reiterate again, ANCs have great weight, and what is in the statute really just says that the relative agency or the relevant agency needs to respond to you. And that's about the power that you get. There's a bigger conversation to be had about how you can, I think, manipulate that power for good or for evil in some ways. But for the most part, that's sort of what it means. It's an advisory position, and that just may mean that your ANC email address gets a little bit more weight with a certain agency. So in Chelsea's example of a constituent emailing about a particular DC water project, she, an unelected, unpaid volunteer official, is not going to know everyone on the DC water org chart. But that does mean that her email address basically carries a little bit more weight when contacting a MOCR, say, to resolve that issue.
We will get into that a little bit more, that whole dynamic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Slide.
Yes. So I will stop giving a preview for the rest of this.
So what sort of work is involved in the role? Here's some broad categories of work that we mapped out, and then we'll get into some specific examples of what comes across an ANC commissioner's desk. So broadly speaking, the sort of work that you do as an ANC includes attending monthly public commission meetings and voting on resolutions in those meetings, drafting resolutions to be introduced at upcoming meetings, serving on committees, on some commissions. My commission does not have any committees, and I think we are weaker for it. But many, if not most, ANCs do have different committees, like a planning and zoning or a transportation committee or a public safety committee. Providing constituent services, and this is sort of what we were just talking about. This often involves referring people to the appropriate source of help, like 311 or the MOKers. Sometimes maybe you do have the answer, but more often you're shuttling people where they need to go. Testifying at hearings, such as council oversight hearings or zoning hearings or historic preservation hearings. Representing the commission with DC agencies. Sometimes your commission may actually authorize you to represent them on a particular issue with DC agencies. Alternately, you yourself will just spend a lot of time liaising with DC agencies or with council members' offices or with community groups just in your role as an individual commissioner. And then what comes across an ANC's desk most frequently? Liquor license renewals or applications for new liquor licenses. My neighborhood is tiny, and yet we have liquor license renewals just about every month. BZA cases, that's zoning, or HPRB cases, that's the Historic Preservation Review Board, if you live in a historic district. For me, I see more HPRB cases than just about anything else. Public safety concerns from residents, that's probably one of the more common things that you'll get emails about. Residents struggling to navigate bureaucracy. Some of these examples have kind of come up, like permit approvals, that DC Water example I gave, how to report quality of life issues like poorly maintained parks or illegal dumping. It's a little interesting that ANCs become the front lines of so many of these questions like that come up for residents. It just shows how much more needs to be done for residents just to be able to access the sort of constituent services they need for these very reasonable questions. But I probably get more emails with random questions like this of just people getting stuck in the bureaucracy and not knowing how to solve problems than just about anything else. Traffic safety concerns come up a lot, and public space applications like restaurant sidewalk seating or streeteries. Any others? I know the panelists, we all looked at this beforehand, but anything else that comes across your desk frequently, or do you want to unpack any of these examples in a little bit more detail?
I'll just say like quickly, and I know Chelsea, you have experience with historic districts too, but I think some of these can seem a little daunting. Like I also live in a historic district and it's like, how will I deal with this? But you have the support of the office, right? So the Historic Preservation Review Board, like the office of the OP has like a report that they produce, and you have them as resources as well. So while all of these seem like, oh my God, I have to learn, you don't have to, and you can use a lot of those supports to get a lot of these things done. Historic preservation does take up a lot of my time as well. But again, your commission can come up with different ways to streamline the process so that it can work more efficiently too.
For various agencies, almost everyone has an ANC liaison on their staff whose job is to help you get stuff done within their agency. It is their job to answer your emails when you are the connector of that issue. That'll be given out to commissioners once you're installed. It's a list. There's going to be some turnover in these positions. They sometimes could be very entry level or a first tier to get inside the door of an agency, but good relationships with them really get things done.
So these are, this is a list of some of the things that you'll encounter the most frequently, but then there's a bonus question here for the panelists. I'm wondering if anybody has any particularly unusual things that have come across their desk just for fun that they want to share.
Maybe I'll start with one, which was I was involved with both of the school improvement team, school modernization plans for both our elementary school and then the middle school in the neighborhood. And as we were in the midst of it, facing and trying to debate how play space and parking would all work out. We haven't said the P word yet tonight, so I'll be the first to break that. But we discovered buried in the rules that the school, given its proximity to Metro, this is for the middle school, was actually allowed to have half the number of parking spaces on site than what they needed. So we were able to get, because we dug in the rules, able to get a full-size soccer and baseball field now used by the whole community and Capitol Hill Little League, and it's been great. But had we not dug into the zoning and parking rules to find that and remind DCPS that they didn't need to build the number that they thought they needed to build, we would not have had that great community amenity. So I think trust but verify. You get one answer and then you kind of dig in a little more and please show me where it says that. And then you can sometimes find some really great things that can get and advance the work that you want to have advanced.
I have two really granular examples that are maybe not that, well, for this crowd, maybe they are interesting. But one was a local business installed an ATM on the property outside their business. And I think it was some company went to them and was just like, hey, can we put an ATM outside your business? And they were like, sure. And you need a public space permit to do that. Which at the time I had not really dealt with public space permits. So it's kind of my first encounter of that. But then it was like, well, so then what do we do with this ATM? And that who is even the company to get in touch with them to like deal with it? It just was like one of those, it was just a quirky, just a very quirky, random little situation that emerged. And eventually the business owner was like, I don't want to deal with a permit. And they just got rid of the ATM. Another one that came up that was sort of a loophole, something of a loophole-ish in DC law was one neighbor had a tree that kept dropping, it was dying and it kept dropping branches on the neighbor's property and at some point dropped a branch on the neighbor's car and damaged the car. And the neighbor was like, how do I get them to remove the tree? And I contacted DDOT's urban forestry team, which by the way is basically the greatest team of public servants in DC government. Everybody loves the DDOT urban forestry team. And it turns out because the tree was on private property, it's basically outside their jurisdiction, even though it was dropping branches. It really came down to the two homeowners having to work that out amongst themselves. But I'm oversimplifying, but it was kind of like, it was just surprising that this tree that clearly needed to come down and was causing problems actually fell outside the purview of what you would think would be the regulations that would have taken care of it. So you'll become a little bit of an expert on the most random niche issues. Anything else from other commissioners before we move on?
I'll give a funny one. I had a constituent tell me that their neighbor's dog poops in their yard and they wanted me to stop them from doing that. And at that point, I just said, have you talked to your neighbor? We're adults here. And they said, I have not talked to my neighbor, but isn't this your job? And I proceeded to tell them, you please talk to your neighbor. And then if for some reason your neighbor's aggressive or something else, then I'm happy to facilitate a conversation, but you're not getting out of this without having a conversation with them. Even if I get involved, you're having a conversation with them. And they finally said, fine, I'll just let the poop stay in the yard.
Okay, so let's talk a little more about the powers that ANCs have, both formally and informally. So we've mentioned great weight. Great weight is in some ways the power of ANCs, but with a giant but attached to it. Essentially, when the DC government is considering certain types of actions in a commission area, they have to notify the commission, and that ANC has the ability to weigh in, to advise, to pass a resolution advising government to do something or other about what they're proposing. And the issues, as I bolded here, the issues and concerns raised in the recommendations of the ANC must receive great weight from the government entity. Great weight requires written acknowledgement of the ANC's recommendations and explicit reference to each issue and concern from the government entity. So in other words, ANCs are advisory. A lot of people think ANCs carry like force of law or something, or think that ANCs have tons of power to demand that things happen. Well, we can demand, but it's still just advice. agencies are under no obligation to do what ANCs advise them to do. But the law does say essentially, if you're not gonna take the ANCs up on their guidance, on what they've advised you to do, you at least need to tell them why. Like, you need to respond point by point to everything that they've requested. That almost never happens. Is that fair to say? In practice, agencies frequently disregard great weight. The DC auditor released a study not long ago finding that great weight is applied unevenly, and that DDOT in particular just kind of ignores great weight altogether. So in some ways, it's like ANCs are shouting into the void when they weigh in on things in which they are supposed to be given great weight. Sometimes you just get basically no response whatsoever. Does anybody want to talk about that a little bit more, or maybe give an example of kind of a recommendation that just the sorts of things that come up where theoretically you would have great weight, but then nothing really, you never really hear back.
I can add some, and I think it's really clear to clarify this. It's ANCs don't have great weight on everything they do. It's when they are party to a government action legally and required. So I can't just have great weight to change the name of the street or to move a football team that's potentially has a racist name somewhere else or something, right? It's like, it has to be like a zoning case that's actually in your ANC that requires zoning approval, not by right. So I think neighbors think, oh, you can weigh in on this and they have to listen to you. They absolutely don't. The law is very specific. And a couple of points is, the great weight has to be applied to the reasons you raised for why you support, oppose, or are neutral to it. So it's not that they give great weight to how the commission voted on what to do. It's the explanation about what the commission asked to do with that advisory note. And so I think that's often a big mistake of like, oh, we voted for it, but we never showed up and explained that case, or we didn't pass a resolution explaining why we were doing this thing. I think zoning is a thing that kind of just can frustrate everyone. I'll share with that is BZA, Board of Zoning Adjustment, when you have certain levels of thresholds of cases that aren't by right, you need a little bit of extra permission to go through, have wonderful clauses in the regulations that say there is no case precedent within the same SMD, within houses next door to each other, requesting the same exact zoning relief. And so commissions can weigh in and say, we oppose this house next door doing this. This house now next door is doing the same thing. In the past, you rejected it. Please use precedent to do the same thing. You can articulate a very good case, and they can then dismiss essentially the ANC's guidance and not have to give great weight to it because it's not germane to the case, because precedent does not carry over to other cases. And so there's a lot of minutia in how great weight gets applied that can be really challenging to kind of wrap your head around and to really explain to community members who think it's your simple vote should have done that thing, or you voted for this, why did it not get approved? Or more likely than not, vote against this to stop this thing. In reality, voting no is you're advising that entity on how to vote, and you're giving that explanation about why to vote no. You're not just saying, we voted no, block it.
In my experience, related to Jonah's point, you will find a lot of residents who place misdirected hope or misdirected frustration on the ANC because they think that your vote means a thing will happen, whether that's a good thing, whether they are glad about that or not. ANCs tend to be the most accessible frontline elected officials with these monthly public meetings in the neighborhood and resolutions that are being passed or introduced about very hyper local issues. And so it's very common for residents to sort of put all their hopes, fears, and frustrations on the ANC. And it can be kind of a difficult conversation and a very complex, because this is not straightforward. Great weight, the idea of great weight is not straightforward. The idea that you've got all these elected officials who represent your neighborhood, but who don't actually have the ability to make something happen or not, is a hard one to explain. And it's a dynamic that comes up again and again and is the source of a lot of confusion. So other powers that ANCs have, formally and informally. In my opinion, the informal power is maybe the more useful. And that is really this first thing here. ANCs as the squeakiest wheel that can get the grease. As an ANC commissioner, you have a dc.gov email address. You are an elected official. That means your emails are slightly more likely to be answered in a timely fashion and in a helpful fashion by DC agencies or council members than probably the average residents. You have a little bit of authority and you can use it very effectively if you choose to do so. You're in a leadership role in your community. It is one that is recognized. So you can introduce a resolution, your commission can pass a resolution asking for a stop sign at an intersection or what have you. But that's not going to do anything. Like that is exceedingly unlikely to do anything unless you follow up. Unless you are that squeaky wheel that is persistent in following up with the relevant agency and asking for the status of your resolution, who is building relationships with the transportation planner, who is like making the decision or whatever. Like your effectiveness is so largely tied to your ability to be persistent in going after the changes that you're trying to make, to forming good, productive working relationships with staffers in your council member's office, with your MOCR, with the ANC liaisons or the relevant staff at the agencies you're trying to work with, and over time, getting a feel for how the bureaucracy works. Over time, you'll figure out, oh, like that's the person who seems to be able to nudge things along in DDOT, or, oh, that's the person at DPW who's really responsive to emails. You'll build those relationships over time. And those are the commissioners I've seen be most effective in their roles are the ones who are persistent and who have those good working relationships and are able to keep things moving. Anyone else on sort of that more informal or soft power or your experience of how that works as an ANC?
Maybe I'll just add one quick example after being repeatedly denied an all-way stop at an intersection that is a main school route. Taking a video of the Eastern High School marching band walking down said route and going through the intersection. Still didn't manage to get the all-way stop we were looking for, but we finally had a raised crosswalk installed. So using all of the tools at your disposal, even if you've exhausted the emails, if you've been denied something, if you've being able to turn to your community member advocacy, that they can also start to nudge from other directions, or social media is one additional tool in your toolbox to use.
That's a
sometimes,
great point.
sorry. I was going to add, sometimes these relationships, local, really dependent on your ward council member as well. If you have a really good ward council member, you can do a lot of great stuff. If you have a ward council member who's combative with you, a lot of stuff can stall. When these depend on potentially budgets that they need to put in every fiscal year to get that thing funded, or you need their help really pushing that agency in addition with you. If you want to be combative out of the gate, just know that your ability to get things done may diminish real fast.
The best case scenario, you will have a good working relationship with your council member, and the sort of collaborative partnership that can emerge from that, where you raise an issue and your council member gets money for that in the next budget. That's like the dream scenario. It doesn't always work that well. But even in the case that you work with your council member's office, they get money for your thing in the next budget, then you have to make sure that money actually gets spent, like that the work actually starts. So that's where it's not like, oh yay, I got this road redesign funded in the budget. That doesn't mean that DDOT is going to start the planning process in a timely fashion, or whatever the agency is, or whatever the issue is, the persistence still comes into play. This is also when we talk about time management and time commitment and setting boundaries, that it's not possible to do everything, because the reality is that DC's bureaucracy moves so slow, and things are so unlikely to happen unless you are nudging and nudging and nudging and nudging until things happen. You can only do that with so much stuff. You just kind of have to be selective about what issues you care most about and where you're going to direct the most time. But that said, if you're strategic, you can be really effective. There are a lot of commissioners who have accomplished a lot of stuff in their neighborhoods, none of it really related to great weight and resolutions, all related to those relationships that they built in agencies and their ability to push projects forward.
Yeah, as weird as it sounds, I hate giving this advice to people because it sounds really negative, but like, don't be too ambitious. Like, I think that there is a level of like, provide good service to your neighbors, to your community who has elected you. But don't think that you're going to build an affordable housing project or get a protected bike lane or that kind of thing. You know, ANCs are elected every 2 years. Commissioners are coming in midstream to a lot of processes that are already happening, either with the district government or by private sector partners. Again, this is an advisory position. So as amazing as it is to have like really positive energy and a ton of positive ideas, like which is an amazing thing. And I'm always like happy to see that when we do these trainings. Like, I think what brings success, especially like for individual commissioners, is being super focused. You know, you can maybe choose one project and try to chip away at it for about 2 years, but it's a short period of time. Again, you're in an advisory position, you're entering a midstream process for a lot of other stuff going on in your neighborhood. So focus on being good, focus on being friendly, being accessible, getting answers to people, and maybe choose one specific project rather than trying to think that you're going to save the world, because maybe people will act like they're expecting you to do that, but that's not what this job is, and it's okay not to do that.
Thanks, Alex. So ANCs receive an annual allotment from DC government. That's the funding that DC government gives to each commission. It is not given to individual commissioners. It is given to the commission. The amount of funding that your ANC receives depends on the size of your commission. So my commission is 5 people and our annual allotment is about $13,000. Not a ton of money. Maybe that sounds like a ton of money. That's not a ton of money. I saw a question come up earlier around like, why do some ANCs have paid administrative support and others do not? A lot of that is because of budget. So my 5-person commission has to do the same amount of like treasurer reports and recording minutes and updating our website as a 12-person commission, but we get less than half the funding of a 12-person commission with $13,000. And we have other just sort of operational expenses. You can barely hire part-time, meaningful part-time help for that amount of money, like barely. So we just haven't. We've been doing all the admin stuff ourselves, which means we're actually a lot less effective and do a much poorer job of communicating than we would if we had paid help. I think the likelihood of having paid help increases as the size of the commission increases. Why I have this on this slide as in terms of what powers the ANCs have is because, you know, money is power, and specifically ANCs do have the ability to make grants, and we don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but every commission has its own bylaws that govern how it gives out grants, if it gives out grants. There's some very tight restrictions around what you can give grants for, which would be a whole other sort of, wearing my former treasurer hat, a whole other sort of rant. But All that said, ANCs do have the ability to give grants to community organizations for various things. They're often fairly small grants, but it can be a meaningful and nice thing to be able to do in the neighborhood. And then the last thing on this slide, liquor licenses and settlement agreements. This is one of those points in time where ANCs do have a certain amount of leverage to influence what happens with local businesses who are seeking liquor licenses. In my neighborhood, our liquor licenses tend to be routine renewals. They're very uncomplicated. We just approve that. We just say like, yep, this license should be renewed. There's not much else to it, but the process can involve more complicated negotiations to arrive at a settlement agreement when there is a liquor license application that's in front of the commission. Did any of the other panelists have an example or want to talk briefly about what that process has looked like on your commissions?
We have some, and I think I was the only one on the email thread, so I can talk briefly through it. It's a bit of a mixed bag with how people view it. Say ABRA, which is Alcoholic Beverage Regulatory Association, Administration, whatever the A is, authority, I think maybe actually. Their advice to commissions that they do publicize is that commissions should have settlement agreements with all entities that have liquor licenses. And one reason they say this is to know is that liquor license is good for a 3-year span. And during that time, you can't really challenge a liquor license if there's noise violations, trash, fights, things happening at that establishment based on probably alcohol service. Having a settlement agreement within that can allow the terms to say the ANC can ask for help at some point from ABRA if an establishment does become an issue in the community. The other thing to know with this is that settlement or liquor licenses live at the property and not at the establishment. The establishment moves and it's at 100 Pennsylvania Avenue. The new establishment that moves into 100 Pennsylvania Avenue inherits that liquor license. And so you never know who potentially is going to take over a license. You may have had a great establishment you had a great relationship with. Another one may move in with a different relationship. So ABRA's recommendation is to set settlement agreements, especially while you have good relationships. My commission for a while had a standing rule that we opposed all ABRA renewals until they went into a settlement agreement with us. And we outlined just, I think, 3 things in our settlement agreement: the hours of operation that we agreed to up front so they could never be changed to later operations. Trash collection, outdoor space just had to be maintained to a manageable degree. It's not every single hour it has to be checked. It's just managed, tidy trash. Noise had to be controlled to some extent and controls in place. And then I think actually there's a 4th one around safety. It was a pretty easy thing to do, but it causes challenges because the vehicle to get to a settlement agreement, if the establishment doesn't want it, is you have to protest their establishment. And it's very negative, counterintuitive way of having to set it up. By protesting their liquor licenses commission, ABRA will have you enter into like negotiations immediately with them and go into settlement agreements. But publicly, it's very difficult because the community might see you protesting a well-established restaurant or something in the community. Like, why are you going after them right now when the economy is so rough? And it can be very hard to then say, this is the only way we can enter into this agreement to protect us should that establishment leave and something worse come in, or should they decide to move their hours to 4 a.m. or whatever. Touchy subject. Manage it, dance around it very carefully if you have to do it, and get a lot of community buy-in and awareness about what you're attempting to do.
Thanks, Jonah. Okay, so what powers do ANCs have formally and informally? Continuing on, planned unit developments. We just want to spend like 3 minutes on this. We're actually running out of time. Turns out there's a lot to talk about with ANCs, but just sort of what are they and what's the role of an ANC, and just know that if you are when you're serving as a commissioner, there will be additional trainings on this available to you. Jonah, did you want to just kind of use the example of the one from your commission area
Sure.
to kind of outline what a PUD is?
Yeah, so ANC 4C recently had a PUD at the Dance Loft on 14th Street, which you may have seen. It made a lot of news and coverage. I think Greater Washington covered some of it as well. Essentially, a PUD is going to be like a high density area usually where a developer or just a project wants to go above what the density allowance is required in the zoning regulations. And in order to do that, the district allows a PUD process in which that applicant has to then offer community benefits back to that community that the community can negotiate on top of everything else to allow this increased thing. And this can be anything from the community can negotiate more affordable housing, which for us, the Dance Loft, we allowed them to go higher and denser because they offered much more affordable housing than the minimum requirements. And so we found that as a fantastic trade-off to say, you can go higher, slightly higher. You're not significant, you're not doubling the size, but you're adding like an additional floor, additional FAR, floor area ratio, depending on which zone you're in exchange for that. They can also offer things like community space that's open to the public for a community room that can be rented. They can also then do financial contributions to community nonprofits in exchange. And it's all just a big community negotiation that is much more complex than a simple Board of Zoning adjustment case, a special exception or variance. It's timely, there's a lot of meetings, but sometimes you can have fantastic results. For us, 66% of the Dance Loft is going to be affordable at 80, 50, and 30% AMI, which is just a fantastic outcome for us. And so the meetings, all the work for 8-9 months, really worth it.
Thank you.
And I want to emphasize that, like, this is in the slide, but not every ANC is going to have a PUD in it every term, every year. Like, there are some hotspots, I would say, if you're on U Street, Reeves and Engine 9 will be coming up. Yeah, Jonah, to your point, one PUD case in 6 years. This is not like the world's most common thing. When it does happen, basically, like, you are the negotiation party. So, like, you're not entering that as making necessarily like demands or running the conversation. Like, you are the representative of the community by dint of being an elected official in an established process that the district government has some rules around. So I know that a number of people on this call are really jazzed about the potential to add affordable housing in their neighborhood, which I am super supportive of. The ways to do that technically are limited. If you do have a PUD in your ANC, that may be one way to do it, and you will be doing it as part of like a pretty well-established process that will still be complex and confusing, but is something that has happened before. So, that's where you do want to look out for the training from Office of Zoning on what those terms are. That's something where we can help you out with sort of understanding what some of the particulars are. But please note that, like, not every ANC is going to have one of these all the time.
I think one of the more surprising things for ANC commissioners, new ANC commissioners, is probably that most of us in most of our SMDs, most of the time, have very little ability to directly influence what's happening with affordable housing. Because these PUDs are not everywhere all the time, because the nature of the role, we're not directly, the way the opportunities present themselves are like very particular and not continual. As a counterpoint with transportation, you could be like, I want a stop sign there, I want a stop sign there, I want a bike lane there, I want this sidewalk widened, DDOT, work with me, make all this stuff happen. There's a lot of, that's all in public space. There's a lot of ability to just kind of push for things you want to see. Housing is more particular. It's more particular, it's more specific, constrained by what projects are coming online. Are there projects coming online? Sauleh, go ahead.
Just want to inject a little bit of positivity. Like, I totally agree. Like, you're not going to become an ANC commissioner and stand up 100% affordable housing building in your neighborhood or construct a completely protected bike lane. But at the same time, when opportunities come up, you're actually in a very good position to cause change. And I see Commissioner Pagets from our ANC is in the crowd, and she actually recently ushered through way more affordable housing on a building project that was going on by talking to the developers and convincing them to add it, and provided lots of ways of doing that. So yes, while I totally agree that a lot of times this position seems bad, but some of the times you're actually in a position to cause really big change. And really kudos to Commissioner Pagets for that. And I think that's a really good example of how ANCs can actually cause positive change, even if it's not at the scale that you would imagine.
Or that's amazing, and situation specific, right? Like I'm in a historic district. I have had, I could give 2 examples of like kind of touching on housing, but it has not been an area where I've been in a position to wield the sort of influence that I wish I could, because the opportunities aren't coming up.
But I do think Sauleh brought up a really important point, which is that like starting from yes is a really good place to be here, because like when people come to an ANC, like looking for that representation, like as the neighborhood, which is kind of what you're elected to be, that like starting from yes is a much more favorable negotiation point, rather than like, we need to see you demonstrate X, Y, Z, A, B, C to prove your worth. Like that may for sure come up later, but it's better to open conversations as an elected representative with yes and I think that's something that especially, this round of 3 city commissioners has been really amazing at. And I've been very impressed by, all of you doing that kind of collectively together.
I have a non-housing example to maybe quickly add that we haven't touched on with respect to building coalitions and even working across ANCs. So we've had several joint letters now with 6B and 6C, our adjacent commission areas, particularly around transportation, where we hear a great demand for improvements to be made or traffic safety, but it's going to be not just our segment, but an additional segment. And we were able to, I think, really excitingly influence DDOT in advance of them even coming to us with their plans for H Street. So if you haven't seen H Street, they did provide the initial concept designs. It looks like we might get streetcar and bus 24/7 transit only lanes. Our commissions, both 6A and 6C, sent a letter a year ago thinking that we wanted DDOT, we wanted Office of Planning to move forward in this regard. So in advance of them even coming to us, we indicated that we were receptive to this and would really like to see that, and that we'd already reached out to all the businesses. We also built a coalition with Friends of the Streetcar in the same way, and have been doing door knocking along the businesses on H Street. So just to say, sometimes that coalition building across commissions, but also with different organizing community organizations can be really helpful, even getting out ahead of what the agencies. So you're not just reacting to everything that the agencies are coming to you with, but you're indicating your receptivity to something, and hopefully that can help move things along a little bit more quickly.
So because we are just about at time, and I'm sorry for questions we didn't get to, I think we were able to hit on a lot of them over the course of this conversation. I'd like to invite my fellow commissioners here, if you have any final reflections for folks on, at the end of the day, why should they run for ANC? Or at the end of the day, any caveats about running for ANC that you'd like to leave people with?
I'll start it. I put some notes real fast, so let the 2 of you think if you want. I'll start off by saying, if you think you're doing this as a stepping stone to council or mayor, this is probably not the right path for you. There are much better stepping stones. Do this because you love your very local neighborhood and really want to help it. I think all of us can understand, get it, that government in a hyper-local, national, whatever level is as good as the people who run and are willing to serve in that role. If you look around and you see, my commissioner's not doing this or something, and you can do better, please run. Please offer yourself to your neighbors and let your neighbors decide, what is right for them in their community. I think for those of you, if you've made it this far in this meeting tonight, you spent 2 hours with us, you are ready to run. Let this be the sign that you needed to say, take out paperwork, go do it, give it a try. What's the worst that's going to happen? If you're on the fence, if any of that, I think Chelsea maybe mentioned imposter syndrome a little bit earlier. There's probably nobody more qualified than any of us individually, you, to run for this position. You are ready. The resources will be available for you as much as anyone else, and just really encourage it. It's a great chance to understand your neighbors in a different way, understand the businesses in your neighborhood, really understand things. Even if you're not successful, I think it's just incredibly rewarding to run and put yourself out there and say, I'm willing to step up and do this. At the end of the day, it's a 2-year commitment. You do not need to commit to a 5-year plan or something big. If at the end of that term you can't do it again, or you don't want to do it again, or something else comes up, okay, not a problem. It's time for somebody else to kind of step up and take it. So run if you're thinking about it. If you're on this call, you know you want to kind of deep down, just do it. It's great.
Thank you, Jonah. Anyone else?
We were trying to see who would go first. I would just add, that was a great statement, Jonah. And my yes and to that would be, it's just a great opportunity to meet people across the city and all of their superpowers. I've drawn things from Jonah's work. I've looked at some of Sauleh's as well. This community of people who are really committed in their volunteer, outside of their day jobs, outside of their family, to put in the work to try and make all of our neighborhoods better and contribute to making DC as a whole a more vibrant, thriving place where everybody can really enjoy our city and develop, is just such a privilege to be able to access all of you and help and continue to work on that. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight, Chelsea and Alex. It's been great to hear all of you again, and look forward to future collaboration.
Thank you, Amber. Sauleh.
I agree with everything. I'll just add one little thing, which I think the ANC system in DC is actually one of the ways that inequality is perpetuated in the city. Because think about who runs as an ANC commission. People who might have the time and the money and the resources, right? And often if you're one of those people that you're like, I don't understand how decisions in the city are made when, you know, when they're not made for the average person perhaps living in this city, it's because of this. And so, yes, it involves a lot of sacrifice on behalf of yourself and all of that. But you will actually see, once you're in this position, how power is wielded, and power is wielded in communities, and power is wielded by people. And so if you are one of those people that really cares about inequity in the city, and you just, please do run. Yeah, it can be rewarding. I know we talked a lot about how, you know, we don't have a lot of power as an ANC, but if you don't run, then you're ceding a lot of power as well. And so I really, really encourage everyone to run.
Thank you, everyone. Oh, Alex.
And I am not an ANC commissioner, but I want to say that I have leaned on a number of people on this call for insight into what's going on in their neighborhoods and how we can be useful. So the context setting of what is happening is really helpful. GGWash doesn't advocate necessarily on individual projects very much anymore. That's not really like what we're quite set up to do, but we are set up to be a backstop and provide some insight. And that's something that we really depend on individual commissioners and proactive commissions to see. So I am looking forward to the more resources that we can provide to ANCs over the next few years, working with so many, you know, for Amber, Sauleh, Jonah, and also many people in the chat has been just like insanely rewarding. So thank you all for your time. Thank you all for being here. I do hope you run. I think everyone has my email address, but feel free to email me if you have any questions and I will direct it to the right person. I think everybody else's emails are in the chat. We will be sending out this recording. We will be posting it. We will be emailing it. It will be available. There are no secrets here. And if you have any questions, or if you are thinking about running or need some assistance, like feel free to ping me and I will do the phone tree directory to where it needs to go. So thank you all for being here. This was fantastic attendance.
Thank you, everybody, and good luck. Take care.